Good evening. I'm Jim Beitler, the director of the Wade Center, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight to our lecture. Welcome also to people joining us online, including new members of the Continuing Scholars Program. We're glad you're here with us. This evening's talk is sponsored by the Stephen and Marjorie Mead Endowment, a fund that supports scholarship and presentations on the 7 Wade authors with a special focus on the topic of spiritual formation. Recently, I've been reflecting on how we ought to think about the Wade authors, on what they should mean to us. And one of the lessons I've learned comes from Lewis himself. In The Personal Heresy, he writes, "To see things as the poet sees them, I must share his or her consciousness and not attend to it. I must look where he looks and not turn around to face him. I must not make of him a spectacle, but a pair of spectacles." So that's one answer. We shouldn't idolize the Wade authors. Rather, we should consider them as spectacles to see with. A related answer comes from tonight's speaker, Amy Baik Lee. In her book, This Homeward Ache, Lewis, Tolkien, Chesterton, MacDonald, and even Wade founder Clyde S. Kilby are not only presented as spectacles to see with, but as fellow travelers and trustworthy guides, offering us their ideas and their stories to keep us pointed in the right direction, the direction of our true home. Amy's book is about the deep longing that we all have for home. Our hearts are restless, Augustine writes. But there will come a day when that ache, that restlessness will cease. I want to read you what Amy writes about the moment that that restlessness, that ache ceases. She writes, "One day soon, our longing will heal in the most curious way, and we will find that it, our longing, was not a wound that marred our earthly existence, but a cleft through which the fullness of our coming joy shone." Friends, this is a remarkable book. It's full of wisdom and spiritual insight. That's not all about Amy, though. Amy is also a founding member of the Cultivating Project and a contributor to the Rabbit Room. She currently serves on the board of the Anselm Society and is a former co-director of the Society's Arts Guild. After her talk, we're going to have a Q&A, so get your questions ready. I'm going to be asking you for questions. And after that, we're going to be selling copies of Amy's book in our museum, and she will be available to sign your newly purchased copy of the book, or the book that you brought. In another memorable passage from her book, Amy writes that God is a God of Eucatastrophe. In tonight's lecture, The Art of Eucatastrophe, the Ministry of Celebration in the Life of the Anxious Soul, promises to reflect more on that theme. Please join me in welcoming Amy Baik Lee.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Dr. Beitler. I would like to start by saying a special thank you to Marjorie Mead, who in her own way had a hand in forming my faith in my early years. This is a copy of C.S. Lewis's Letters to Children, and on the back cover is the price of $11,521 because I bought this in South Korea when I was a middle or high school student, and I kept it around for many days and months because I think it gave me a picture of what it looked like for a Christian to serve in the place of his calling and how to regard people as people with souls, people with eternal worth. And so I'm really indebted to her for being an editor of this book and for making this available to us. And so I think In a sense, it can be said that the work of the Mead Endowment for Spiritual Foundation goes much further back than its official establishment in 2021, and may it continue to flourish. All right. On a July night in 2016, I walked shakily into the local emergency room with what I thought were symptoms of a heart attack. I could not regulate my breathing or my heart rate, which has since been clocked at 150 beats per minute at rest during similar episodes. For a few hours before this, I had lain still in bed with freezing limbs, staring at the ceiling fan, willing myself to sleep against the feeling that something was wrong. At some point, I hyperventilated for the first time in my life. The nerves in my temples and legs then sent alternating signals of electric pain and numbness to my brain, like loose wires sparking and fizzling in a storm. At the hospital, after a whirlwind of blood draws and an EKG, the medical resident assured me that the attending physician would be by soon and left the room. I sat huddled on the bed, and at that moment, I realized that if the doctor said there was nothing wrong with my heart, then it would mean that my mind had the capability to push itself and my body into this chaos. Right then, I could not decide whether that or the diagnosis of an actual heart attack was more terrifying. The doctor came in, checked my legs for swelling, and glanced over my chart. "I don't see anything wrong. I think we can call this a classic panic attack," he pronounced, and left the room. The young nurse who had slipped in with him looked at me. "Sometimes it's easier to get panic attacks if you're not hydrated. Drinking water can help," she offered. All these years later, I remember her kindness. I left the hospital that day with a circulatory system that was deemed healthy, but with nerves shot and a mind shattered. Recovery would take both months and years. A few months later, I came across Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, Nondum, and I'd like to share it in full with you here in case you haven't encountered it yet. Nondum, verily thou art a God that hidest thyself. Isaiah 45:15. God, though to thee our psalm we raise, no answering voice comes from the skies. To thee the trembling sinner prays, but no forgiving voice replies. Our prayer seems lost in desert ways, our hymn in the vast silence dies. We see the glories of the earth, but not the hand that wrought them all. Night to a myriad worlds gives birth, yet like a lighted empty hall where stands no host or door or hearth, vacant creation's lamps appall. We guess, we clothe thee, unseen King, with attributes we deem our meet. Each in his own imagining sets up a shadow in thy seat, yet know not how our gifts to bring, where seek thee with unsandaled feet. And still the unbroken silence broods, while ages and while aeons run, as erst upon chaotic floods the spirit hovered, ere the sun had called the seasons' changeful moods, and life's first germs from death had won. And still the abysses infinite surround the peak from which we gaze. Deep calls to deep, and blackest night giddies the soul with blinding days that dares to cast its searching sight on being's dread and vacant maze. And thou art silent, whilst thy world contends about its many creeds, and hosts confront with flags unfurled, and zeal is flushed, and pity bleeds, and truth is heard with tears impearled, a moaning voice among the reeds. My hand upon my lips I lay, the breast's desponding sob I quell. I move along life's tomb-decked way and listen to the passing bell, summoning men from speechless day to death's more silent, darker spell. Oh, till thou givest that sense beyond, to shew thee that thou art and near, let patience with her chastening wand dispel the doubt and dry the tear, and lead me childlike by the hand, if still in darkness, not in fear. Speak, whisper to my watching heart one word, as when a mother speaks soft, when she sees her infant start, till dimpled joy steals o'er its cheeks. Then, to behold thee as thou art, I'll wait till morn eternal breaks. In the prayers that seem lost in desert ways, and the disoriented guesses with which we clothe thee, unseen King, Hopkins showed me that he understood intimately the pain of waiting in the face of the silence of God, surrounded by seeming abysses infinite. The cadence of the verses caught my attention, speeding up, as you may have noticed, as it came into the sixth stanza like the acceleration of a pounding heart, and hosts confront with flags unfurled, and zeal is flushed and pity bleeds, and truth is heard with tears impearled, a moaning voice among the reeds. The poem ebbs afterward into the rhythm of a checked sob, and then a prayer such as a weaned child might utter. And lead me childlike by the hand, if still in darkness, not in fear. Those two lines voiced the prayer that would attend all my steps as I tried to move forward from that splintering summer night. Traveling the road beyond it often felt like trying to find stepping stones in the dark. I am neither a psychiatrist or a professional theologian. I am a storyteller, and very often a first-person storyteller, and that viewpoint is the one I bring to tonight's lecture. What I want to do this evening is tell a story of the connection between the discipline of celebration and the rebuilding of a life that is scarred by anxiety. I should clarify that the kind of anxiety I'm talking about isn't the simple kind of worry I feel when I get in the car and I wonder if I've locked the front door. Many who have struggled with the anxiety I'm talking about often have scripture quoted to them as if they have forgotten what it says. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Joshua 1:9. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? Psalm 56, 3-5. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. John 14:27. That the Lord God of the universe is with us, that we need not be afraid, and that indeed the best thing would be to not be afraid. These are glorious truths, beautiful and solid. They rightly address the fact that as followers of God, we have agency over forces without and thoughts within ourselves. But depending on the lives we have lived and the chapters we have had to endure, sometimes we are bruised and lacerated to the point where a simple reminder to not be afraid cannot lighten our loads in an instant. In these cases, the verses I've cited can resound not as an invitation, but as a blunt instruction. Do not be afraid. God is with you. We are capable of using them as admonishment verses, as if the ultimate harm posed by anxiety is that Christians will reflect poorly on our God. It is possible, I believe, to tell an anxious person to not be afraid in the way that, as James chapter 2 points out, we might say to an ill-clothed or hungry person, go in peace, be warmed and filled. What good is that? James asks. If you have ever looked into the face of someone who is suffering from anxiety, and the ones I have encountered myself are the reason I'm giving this talk at all, if you manage to see them past the mask they've fashioned over time, it's almost like seeing the face of someone who is being eaten alive. Sometimes the hurt at the source of a person's anxiety runs deeper than recent history. Sometimes the work of healing takes longer than we expect, and I believe that in such cases what Christ asks of us, his body, what he exemplifies for us, is service rather than censure. Even as we stand steadfast in the truths we know, we must hold an open willingness to be inconvenienced by love. This talk is therefore for people who suffer from anxiety and the people who love them, which, in the end, includes all who are called to Christ's kingdom and story of restoration. In his letters to Malcolm, C.S. Lewis wrote, "Some people feel guilty about their anxieties and regard them as a defect of faith. I don't agree at all. They are afflictions, not sins. Like all afflictions, they are, if we can so take them, our share in the passion of Christ." Hans Urs von Balthasar, in his book, The Christian and Anxiety, discusses forms of anxiety that are incompatible with the faith of people who live under the new covenant, which shows us how broad and perhaps our definition of anxiety, and maybe how inadequate it is today, but how grateful I am for Lewis's words. They provide a place to begin contemplating a journey out of the deepest chasms of anxiety. For many years, even as a teenager, the enemies and adversaries of the Book of Psalms translated most vividly in my mind to internal forces. The terror that David in particular felt, the awareness of being targeted, the relentless pursuit. I knew these firsthand in the context of fear, and they reached their pinnacle on the night of that consuming panic attack. In the third year after that attack, which, for lack of a better word for its magnitude, I just tend to call my breakdown, I came across a question that helped me trace my history with anxiety. The question was, is there a core fear that makes me fragile? Yes. I knew the answer immediately because I could taste the similarity between my post-breakdown anxiety and the hard-edged, venomous fear that I had met at several specific points in my life. There were a handful of times when I had felt a terror so strong and concentrated that every fiber of my body was strained to the breaking point. In motherhood, when my toddler turned blue during 2 seizures. In adolescence, when a classmate told me he was contemplating suicide. All the way back to age 10, when I witnessed a suicide threat and believed that I was the sole person who could prevent that person's death. The particular fuse of the fear varied according to the situation, but the essence of it, that feeling of teetering over a thin crust of ice with devastation of no return underneath, remained the same. Anxiety creates entrenched patterns of thought. I believe part of this happens because in a situation where you have to prepare for contingencies, you run over the scenario again and again, as if you're driving on a road away from a wildfire and keeping an eye on the wind to see if it will shift this way or that. With enough risk and perceived danger, think of the disciples in the boat while the Sea of Galilee raged about them. Our minds can begin to catastrophize. Our preparation for worst-case scenarios can lead to an expectation of worst-case scenarios. In the Summa Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas gives a vivid impression of this expectation. As the object of hope is a future good, difficult but possible to obtain, so the object of fear is a future evil, arduous, and not to be easily avoided. As I tried to find solid mental footing, I knew that not every future evil I imagined could possibly come to pass. Yet I had also reached a point where I was on such high alert that my body sometimes went into a panic attack before my mind had finished taking in the situation. Those words seem to sum it up so easily. It is a terrible thing, suffocating and merciless, to have both your body and your brain hijacked even while you are keeping calm. When this happens, it's hard not to panic about panicking, and some days felt like a relentless cycle. But at one point, early in my recovery, I remembered a voice, a literal voice, from my college days. Now, in order to protect the identity and the shenanigans of the people involved, allow me to say only that one evening, I found myself sitting quite high off the ground on a rather precarious and thin seat. In order to get to safety, I was going to have to stand up on my precarious seat and take a large step up into a sturdier space. Okay, you got that? Just to set it up in your imaginations. But I could not do it. I was absolutely immobilized, my fingers frozen to the edge of my seat, and try as I might, I could not unclamp them. At that moment, I heard footsteps over my head. Amy, look at me. Okay, now give me your hand. I'm not going to let you fall. Keep looking at me. You're going to put your foot up here right next to me. I think that's what she said, my other half, my closest friend in college. What I remember above all is the tone of her voice and how it seemed to surround me in that instant when I could not move an inch because I might fall. Something happened in the experience of my friend being present with me that turned my thoughts from the ground many feet below. Her words, her hand extended toward me, were a turning point that I had not foreseen. J.R.R. Tolkien had a word for such turning points. Eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, he wrote, is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. But it denies universal final defeat, and insofar is Evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. We see then that eucatastrophe is the sudden joyous turn when everything, by all evidence and perhaps by rights, is spiraling toward true disaster. Tolkien coined the term in the context of discussing fairy stories, but he writes later in the same essay that the great story of our world hinges upon such a turn. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history, he says. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. I have raised a follow-up question to this assertion in a friend's book, Matthew Clark's Only the Lover Sings. If we look more closely, were there not also smaller eucatastrophes strewn along the entire road between Cana and Calvary? The woman at the well radiates astonishment at being seen and known. Jairus' daughter rises. Bartimaeus sees. Mary Magdalene breathes freely again. Every act of healing, every resurrection, every forgotten face looked upon with compassion, these were eucatastrophes for each person who encountered Jesus. I believe there are personal, sudden joyous turns that each of us may experience, in which the truth of the incarnation and the triumph of the resurrection are brought home to us. What is more, I believe these personal eucatastrophes enable us to surrender and release ourselves into the keeping of Christ. Looking back, in fact, the reason that I was able to connect the dots of my history with anxiety at all was that a string of circumstances, ranging from the extraordinary to the very ordinary indeed, opened door after door into an awareness of the presence of God. Happenstance conversations with friends. Small beauties that met me in my own garden. A line in a letter from our sponsored child. Slowly and patiently, these micro-eucatastrophes helped me see again that I was in the hands of a God of promise and hope and restoration. When anxiety intersects with the Christian life, sooner or later there often arises a question of surrender. Not a question of general surrender, but a question that addresses a specific modus operandi and a specific fear that we hold. When it comes, I do not think there is any way around it. As I listen to other stories, it seems that it is in our discatastrophes, and perhaps nowhere else, that we come to face our God in ways that we never have before. With raw countenance, our desires stripped to their unpolished essence, our inadequacy glaringly evident to both Him and to ourselves. The hound of heaven, love himself, comes after us until we can hear and voice the central whispers that drive our souls. For me, it was the hidden belief that He expected me to keep the people in my care alive. I spent every ounce of my strength and wits to this end, to the extent that I felt like I could never say I had done my best. If injury or death happened, I assumed He would always tell me I could have done a little more. My surrender of that burden has been a long time coming, and He has it now. That doesn't mean that I no longer have anxiety triggers, panic attacks, or psychosomatic symptoms. But the core issue, that false belief, is out of my hands, and I rest in the knowledge that my life is forfeit. In all the catastrophizing I did, I could never assume that God might intervene, so I ended up simply predicting that He wouldn't. I drew arenas of future possibilities devoid of grace. But as I have become acquainted with Him anew as a God, the God of eucatastrophe, I have begun to call Him my wild card God. I still can't predict or assume what He will do. As Tolkien said, the exact joyous turns I have known cannot be counted on to recur. But I have the confidence of one who has seen overwhelming evidence of His character that He will be with me to the end of the age. So, what comes after surrender? If anxiety involves deep and worn trenches of catastrophic thought, then the rehabilitation of an anxious soul requires building new trenches of thought, patterns of thinking through which we are able to expect hope and healing and the eventual wholeness promised us by our Redeemer. This doesn't mean holding a rose-colored false view of the world. It doesn't mean approaching life with a name-it-and-claim-it stance either. I believe that rehabilitation from anxiety means a resilience of spirit, the ability to expect good of God, whether that goodness comes as deliverance or the ability to see through the suffering that comes our way. But such rehabilitation is not instant. As with most things involving us as a people who are mortal and need reminding, who encounter new situations with old scars, becoming a people of Eucatastrophe is not a one-time work. This is where celebration comes in. I'll define celebration in this lecture as the intentional gathering of a community that involves remembrance, thanksgiving, and often the sharing of a meal. These elements are not particular to the church. We see them in the celebrations of our wider culture as well, like Thanksgiving dinners, birthday parties, anniversary dates. But within the framework of the Old and New scriptural covenants, they show up in a pattern, orienting our perspective Godward. The regularity of feasts provides timely reinforcement of our understanding of his faithfulness. Dallas Willard explains further in The Spirit of the Disciplines, celebration is the completion of worship, for it dwells on the greatness of God as shown in his goodness to us. We concentrate on our life and world as God's work and as God's gift to us. Typically, this means that we come together with others who know God to eat and drink, to sing and dance, and to relate stories of God's action for our lives and our people. In her study of major feasts of the Bible, Invitations to Abundance author Alicia J. Akins observes that feasts can look forward or backward. Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, and the Feast of Weeks, as well as the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, recount the provision and presence of God and also establish reasons that the children of God have to trust him in the future. We also see that these feasts, were not to be detached experiences. The Israelites were to eat bitter herbs and unleavened bread, build booths, and leave the gleanings of their harvests for the hungry to bring home the import of the story they were living and the author at its origin. From the Old Testament to the New, the shared experience of celebration has always involved the gathering of people. According to James K.A. Smith, the church's worship, organized by the cadence of the liturgical calendar, is a calibration technology for the soul and the larger body of Christ. No matter what church tradition you belong to, there is some kind of liturgical rhythm that helps us reset our focus in concert with other Christians throughout the seasons of our lives. This is a point I want to underscore as we consider celebration for people who are struggling with a form of disintegration, whether it be depression or anxiety or other challenges to mental health. We need other people. Psychiatrist Kurt Thompson talks about the middle prefrontal cortex of our brains as the place where much of the work of integration takes place. The work, in other words, of taking up disparate parts of our lives and moving toward health and wholeness. He compares the middle prefrontal cortex to the conductor of an orchestra who knows how to blend feelings and memories and sensations into one harmonious piece. But in order for this part of the brain to develop, he says, it needs the relational interaction of secure attachment. Even as adults, at times we need the presence of others when we are overwhelmed by our chaotic or rigid mental states. The steadying presence of others brings aid, like neighbors coming to help us as we try to dig new irrigation channels in our minds. They may pick up a shovel and pitch in. They may help us to make sense of the contours of the land and see which way the water of our thoughts ought to flow. Or it may simply be the way they hook their thumbs behind their suspenders and marvel at God's tenderness that makes us realize the beauty of our existence and the worthiness of our calling. This kind of community is what we are called to extend to others as emissaries of the love of Christ, as members of his royal priesthood, and as bringers of his peace. So we need community, remembrance, thanksgiving, and a shared experience for celebration. None of this is, perhaps, very surprising or new. But I want to go a step further and suggest that wherever we practice celebration to reforge trenches of joy, the art of eucatastrophe is especially important, even necessary. Put another way, in the realm of spiritual disciplines, celebration in community with art may be one of the richest helps a suffering Christian can receive from the body of Christ. Why art? I stated at the outset of this evening that the anxious person does not have the capacity to turn on a dime when told or reminded of a truth. When we share art, particularly art that demonstrates eucatastrophe, we make it possible for the anxious person to not simply hear about, but experience the astonished lift that a eucatastrophe may bring, to feel like a great good could be right around the corner, and so grow in the hope of making room for the grace of God again. Consider the effect that a favorite story or song, visual art piece, or film has had on you. Very likely, it will not be art that has been issued as propaganda, the kind with a lesson that even a small child can sniff out like a pill hidden in a spoonful of jam. Even if it has such a lesson, I dare say that probably isn't what you loved most about it. It's also likely that it will not be the kind of art that makes straw men of suffering's claims and skips to an unsatisfyingly happy ending. I'm talking about the kind of art, books, songs, short stories, films, paintings, poems, etc., that holds brokenness in one hand and the surety of the restoration in the other, and holds them both out to meet us. In spending time with communities of artists, I have come to believe that the role of the artist is to tell the truth and show the truth, often not about the future, but about the present state of things, and how it relates to what God has said. In this day and age, this kind of truth-telling means addressing our anguish, pain, dysfunction, nearsightedness, need for comfort, need for awareness of sin, and all manner of other needs. When it comes to eucatastrophe, this responsibility does not fade. In order to relay honest and real eucatastrophe, the artist must also tell the truth about discatastrophe. But when it tells the truth, art does not take the avenue of direct preaching. At its best, art creates a shelter, if you will. It opens doors not into a classroom, but into a hidden garden where the air of a new spring and the song of a curious robin wake us up to life beyond our infirmities. If you caught that illusion, you know firsthand what I mean. Art creates an atmosphere and a world to walk in, an invitation that enables the receiver to be transformed day after day by breathing in the oxygen of the grace of Christ. Absorbing bullet points of information might seem easier than generating and sharing this kind of art. In college, I went to a public university. I tried hard to memorize the kinds of apologetic statements I should make in conversation with atheists and agnostics, the steps that I should walk them through, the arguments I should rebut. As an introvert who once wrote herself cue cards for phone calls before I started the conversation, this made sense to me initially. I tried to make it work. But I began to realize that either I could go by a few thousand words in a flow chart, or I could work to become the sort of person who could have an organic conversation about faith without feeling defensive or having an agenda for the other person. There is a difference between memorization and formation. Formation is what story, music, and other modes of art can help bring about within us under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Thus, Lewis writes in his essay on stories about the quality of the atmosphere of stories. In the stories we deem worth rereading, we return not for the excitement of the plot, although that may happen in the first round, but for the sense and feelings those stories kindle in our deeper imaginations. Like Tolkien's protagonist in Smith of Wootton Major, who is forever changed by his wanderings in the vales and woods of Faerie, we too are transformed by the time we spend in the realms that we explore. Walk long enough in a different world, whether a foreign culture on this earth or a fantastic one, and the very tenor of your speech will change. Your customs, your taste for food, even the things that your eyes and ears pay attention to when you first enter a room. Because of this contrast between bald statement and story, Lewis declined an invitation to write for Christianity Today at its inception. Writing to Carl F.H. Henry, he said, "I wish your project heartily well, but can't write you articles. My thought and talent, such as they are, now flow in different, though I trust not less Christian, channels, and I do not think I am at all likely to write more directly theological pieces. The last work of that sort which I attempted had to be abandoned. If I am now good for anything, it is for catching the reader unawares, through fiction and symbol. I have done what I could in the way of frontal attacks, but I now feel quite sure those days are over." Fiction and symbol envelop us in meaning. They steal past those watchful dragons of our inhibitions, as Lewis says elsewhere, and they steep us in realities that we might otherwise find impossible to accept. I'm also not saying that there isn't space or need in the kingdom for frontal attacks. There are, or direct theological discussions, but this is what I want to emphasize tonight. What is true for the general population is, unsurprisingly, even more true for anxious souls. We may know cerebrally that God is good, and certainly it should be stated, but, Kurt Thompson tells us, until we encounter beauty, which he says is God's presence being sensed, God is only ever an abstraction devoid of any power to transform my life. When we encounter beauty, as we do in Eucatastrophic art, I will add, Thompson notes that beauty draws our attention and attunes our hearts to the presence and activity of God. Adela Cathcart by George MacDonald gives an excellent demonstration of this. Over Christmastide, a small group of friends and neighbors gathered to tell stories in the hope of reviving the spirits of an ill and quietly despondent girl. The Light Princess, if you've heard of it, is one of these tales. And it works. In the words of MacDonald scholar Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson, "This is a story of stories that seeks to show how, even when the desire for life is diminished and despair has the upper hand, stories can nourish and fortify and help us to hunger and hope for the life more abundant that is promised in the greatest story, which MacDonald purports all these others herald." In listening to the resulting series of tales, the afflicted Adela begins to heal. As her spirit is lifted, the light and goodness in each story helps prepare the way for the Christ tale she had not earlier been able to receive. Immersed in a range of stories that meet her in grief and laughter and love, Adela's soul and mind and heart and expectations are reformed. They are shaped. Through art, then, we make and hold out formative worlds for each other. For someone who struggles with anxiety, the experience of eucatastrophic art can itself be the eucatastrophe in their long journey, their sudden joyous turn. And continued exposure to such art can be one provision that helps that person begin to expect joy. And even as it reshapes their thinking, art in celebration also gives them something to carry away to bolster their courage. My favorite expression of this phenomenon comes through Frodo and Sam's journey in The Lord of the Rings. These two hobbits leave their homes in the Shire and become couriers charged with the seemingly impossible task of destroying the ring that wants to find its way back to its malevolent master Sauron. Their journey is punctuated with commonsensical pauses for a bite and a sup, though these are often considerably less filling than the hobbits would like them to be, and stops akin to Sabbath rests meet them as well. There are 3 stops in particular that I'd like to point out here. Their sojourns at the house of Tom Bombadil, at Rivendell, and at Lothlorien. These can arguably be viewed as feasts or celebrations of the kind that we have been discussing. Feasts of Eucatastrophe. In the house of Tom Bombadil, Sam and Frodo and their friends experience a feast of stories. Quote, "He, Tom Bombadil, then told them many remarkable stories, sometimes half as if speaking to himself, sometimes looking at them suddenly with a bright blue eye under his deep brows. Often his voice would turn to song, and he would get out of his chair and dance about. He told them tales of bees and of flowers, the ways of trees and the strange creatures of the forest, about the evil things and good things, things friendly and things unfriendly, cruel things and kind things, and secrets hidden under brambles. As they listened, they began to understand the lives of the forest, apart from themselves, indeed to feel themselves as the strangers where all other things were at home." End quote. I can't help but think of a few lines from G.K. Chesterton's A House of Christmas, or House of Christmas rather, as I'm reading those lines because it sounds so familiar. So the lines run thus: "For men are homesick in their homes and strangers under the sun, and they lay on their heads in a foreign land whenever the day is done. To an open house in the evening, home shall men come, to the end of the way of the wandering star, to the things that cannot be and that are, to the place where God was homeless and all men are at home." While listening to Tom's stories about the history of the world, Frodo loses track of time entirely. The book says he did not feel either hungry or tired, only filled with wonder. At Rivendell, we have a feast of songs. They enjoy the food of Elrond's table, where Frodo listens to the news of faraway lands from his dinner companions. When the meal is over, all move to the Hall of Fire. At first, the beauty of the melodies and interwoven words in elven tongues, even though Frodo understood them little, held him in a spell as soon as he began to attend to them. Almost it seemed that the words took shape, and visions of far lands and bright things that he had never yet imagined opened out before him, and the firelit hall became like a golden mist above seas of foam that sighed upon the margins of the world. At Lothlorien, our third stop, a feast of objets d'art, or artifacts. A sheath for Aragorn's sword, a green stone set with a silver brooch, gold and silver belts, a bow and arrows, a box of earth, 3 golden hairs, and the light of Eärendil's star in a crystal phial. These are functional artifacts meant to prepare each member of the fellowship for the challenges to come, to be sure, but they are works of art in themselves as well. In each of these places, Sam and Frodo eat with their hosts. They bring their Thanksgiving with them to the table, and they are steeped in stories of the past, present, and forecasted future. Interestingly enough, I do think those 3 feasts also mark distinct temporal outlooks. Bombadil's feast is the one that memorializes the deep past, Elrond's in Rivendell acknowledges the present, and Galadriel's in Lothlorien looks forward to what is to come, with beauty and with hope. And so we come to a moment, many, many chapters later, at a great and weary remove from that last feast. Frodo and Sam have been in the lair of a deadly monster and emerged separately. Frodo is bound up in a tower guarded by orcs. Sam has got the ring and is determined to find his friend, and though it is likely a suicide mission, he has fought and crept his way up the stairs of the tower, only to find a locked door. He sits there in defeat as the torch goes out. And then softly, the story tells us, to his own surprise, there at the vain end of his long journey and his grief, moved by what thought in his heart he could not tell, Sam began to sing. He murmured old childish tunes out of the Shire and snatches of Mr. Bilbo's rhymes that came into his mind like fleeting glimpses of the country of his home. And then suddenly, new strength rose in him, and his voice rang out, while words of his own came unbidden to fit the simple tune. I won't sing it for you. But here we see how Sam's song, his new creation there on the steps of likely doom, springs from tunes and rhymes from the past, and his defiance of the darkness, in turn, rouses Frodo back to full consciousness beyond the door. His song is Frodo's turn. This scene shows us that the art we share has a vitality and a use well beyond the moment in which we hear or see it. It can equip us for the sacrificial work we have been called to do our whole lives long. So how can we incorporate the nourishment of eucatastrophic art into our own gatherings and communities? Like any discipline, celebration works best with regularity, intention, and a rightly ordered focus on primary things, namely Christ. A few ideas I've witnessed in action include creative observances of the church calendar and its seasons, in which music and art are enjoyed in fellowship rather than as pure performance. Homes that serve as sites of sacramental hospitality and tradition. And along this line, there is a wonderful book coming out next month called Glad and Golden Hours by a friend, Lanier Ivester, that just exemplifies this so well. Get-togethers where people delight in a work or mode of art together. There are households out there that host Lord of the Rings marathons with courses of Middle-earth fare served throughout the day. The Anselm Society in Colorado Springs hosts Shakespeare evenings in the summer, a Narnian Christmas feast in the winter, and pub nights where local artists come share their work with the community, much the way that the Rabbit Room in Tennessee hosts their local shows, Northwind Manor events, and Hutchmoot. I've also been a part of house concerts where musicians play to an audience, but they also bring them into the stories that have engendered those songs. And one last one that we've enjoyed with our family is Family Day, which is a recommendation by Sally Clarkson, where you gather your family once a year. You may have little stones of remembrance with you, and for each stone you share a remembrance of how God has been faithful in the life of your family in the past year. And all of these, in turn, have inspired my family to fill our house at various points of the year with teas in the garden and dinners meant for conversation and mutual encouragement. I told you that I was an introvert, so I'll confess that it is a joy to prepare for these little celebrations and that it takes me a week or two to recover from them. But they are worth it. And starting something like this can be very simple. Ask a handful of friends to come over and to bring one beautiful item with them from their homes and tell the story behind it. They might just surprise you with a tale of Eucatastrophe. The point is to plan for some measure of remembrance, thanksgiving, breaking bread, and art, and inviting and enveloping people who are alone in some way in the warmth of that celebration. For very often, something will happen in the celebration that is more than the sum of all its preparation. To return to our Hobbit heroes for a moment, because I'm not finished with them yet, after the arduous destruction of the ring is over and done, I'm so sorry if I have spoiled and ruined the Lord of the Rings for you in the course of this talk. I should probably have warned you in advance, but if you're here, just stick around. And Frodo and Sam, they sit on the crumbling slopes of Mount Doom. Sam sighs. "What a tale we've been in, Mr. Frodo, haven't we?" he says. "I wish I could hear it told. Do you think they'll say, 'Now comes the story of Nine-Fingered Frodo and the Ring of Doom'? And then everyone will hush, like we did, when in Rivendell they told us the tale of Beren One Hand and the Great Jewel. I wish I could hear it, and I wonder how it will go on after our part." As it happens, after the eagles come and Frodo and Sam end up in Ithilien at the Feast of the King, a minstrel comes in and calls all the assembly to attention. "I will sing to you of Frodo of the Nine Fingers and the Ring of Doom," he says. And as he sings, the story tells us, all the host laughed and wept, and in the midst of their merriment and tears, the clear voice of the minstrel rose like silver and gold, and all men were hushed. And he sang to them, now in the elven tongue, now in the speech of the West, until their hearts, wounded with sweet words, overflowed, and their joy was like swords, and they passed in thought out to regions where pain and delight flow together, and tears are the very wine of blessedness. Holly Ordway provides a striking addendum for this scene. It is not just the characters in the story who weep. Tolkien blotted the page with his own tears as he wrote. He called this moment the peak of the whole epic, and its bittersweet poignancy is so piercing that for a moment it passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through. The gleam comes from his belief that the whole human story is moving toward, and indeed is already participating in, a destiny with a similar sense of loss and gain, of pain and delight, of wounds and joy. The final destiny is the hope of heaven. Yes, we share our art so that in the end, God willing, people may come and lay down their burdens and breathe and hope and find out how their own stories are caught up and woven into the redemptive, restorative arc of God's love, so that they may expect joy not only for the next trial, but for the age to come. The art of the poets I have known, as Andrew Peterson calls them, has played an irreplaceable role in my own rehabilitation. They have helped me to know that I am not alone, cleared the way for me to come into the presence of God, and even hinted at a flip side of anxiety. I'm discovering that the same proclivities that make people with anxiety disorder sensitive to danger and detail can make us sensitive to others and to generating beauty to a degree that we would not otherwise have. I'm getting a sense of what redeemed anxiety may look like in the new creation. I therefore owe a great debt to the healing subcreations of my fellow pilgrims, from Hopkins to Lewis to MacDonald to Tolkien to Chesterton and countless more. They have made art out of the honest materials of their own suffering. The art they have made, they have embodied. And their art has reached me like a steady voice saying, "Take my hand, friend. This very day you are one step closer to home. The tale beyond the sudden joyous turn has already begun, and there are pages in it that await your work." As I was finishing my preparation for this talk, my thoughts flitted back to Frodo and Sam. I reflected it was a pity that Frodo doesn't really get to do this, to experience healing to the extent that he creates something. Sam does. Sam becomes mayor, has children, spreads the earth of Lothlorien under the trees and causes them to flourish. But Frodo has a wound from a clash with the Witch King that will never heal. And then I remembered. Frodo does actually create a work of great beauty. He writes the Red Book of Westmarch, which in terms of Middle-earth lore becomes the source material for The Lord of the Rings. Bilbo began the Red Book, and after Frodo finishes his part, he passes it to Sam with the last pages left blank. In this way, it is as if the leaden assignment of carrying the ring has been transformed and redeemed into something generative. The work passed on from ring bearer to ring bearer is not one of destroying worlds, but of contributing to a project of lasting worth. Instead of fear and suffering, creativity and stewardship. Not discatastrophe, but eucatastrophe. Together. Earlier in their journey, Sam muses, "I wonder if we shall ever be put into songs or tales. We're in one, of course, but I mean put into words, told by the fireside, or read out of a great big book with red and black letters, years and years afterward. And people will say, 'Let's hear about Frodo and the ring.' And they'll say, 'Yes, it's one of my favorite stories. Frodo was very brave, wasn't he, Dad?' 'Yes, my boy, the famousest of hobbits, and that's saying a lot.' 'It's saying a lot too much,' said Frodo, and he laughed, a long, clear laugh from his heart. Such a sound had not been heard in those places since Sauron came to Middle-earth. 'Why, Sam,' he said, 'to hear you somehow makes me as merry as if the story was already written. But you've left out one of the chief characters, Samwise the Stout-Hearted. I want to hear more about Sam, Dad. Frodo wouldn't have got far without Sam, would he, Dad?' It's the sort of thing we will someday say ourselves, I believe. Replenished along the way by feasts that sustain us in our afflictions, we make our way to the celebration from which all celebrations, even now, draw their echo. And perhaps at the very beginning of all things made new, when the Lord of the wedding feast raises his cup, in the pleasure of his countenance, we will look down the long table and see the people without whom we wouldn't have got far. Those sub-creators, those sons and daughters of the author of our faith, all the living, breathing art of eucatastrophe who gave of themselves and helped to bring us there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. At the beginning of Amy's book, you write that you hope the book heartens your fellow travelers. And I think you've done that for us tonight, for sure. We have some time for questions. And so I will move to the middle of the room. If you want to move back to the podium, that's great. Do we have any questions? All right, here we go.
Yeah, you got it. Hello, thank you. That was fantastic. So let me find, I wrote down my question, but you inspired me to write down a lot of stuff, so give me 1 second. Okay, so basically, I'm finding I have to be to someone else what your other half roommate you mentioned was to you when you had your Eucatastrophe. I'm struggling to have the maturity to do so because I experienced the brunt of their verbal abuse during their panic attacks. Try as I may to rise above and be Christ, I keep becoming argumentative and combative rather than helping. That said, Christ keeps calling me to try again. I'd like to finally not suck at it. Thoughts?
Bless you. I think that anxiety is a many-headed creature, and that especially when it comes to being the supporters of somebody who is going through it, that I feel like that also, it helps if that also is not a road traveled alone, and that it's not a burden that I think one person can easily carry, and that's why so often we need community, and that community can include professional or medical help. It can include counselors or mentors. I think boulders move through prayer, but I guess one thing, this is in my very unprofessional or unmedical opinion too, that it can be a loving thing to draw boundaries and also to help the person with anxiety find extra resources, or sometimes drawing the boundaries is the way of helping them find extra resources, I think, in anxiety, and all of the cases are individual. So yeah, I think maybe the most important thing that I could say though is that it's not something that we're meant to carry the brunt of on our own. So I'm sorry if that's unhelpful.
No, it's
But-
okay.
yeah.
It's really complicated.
Yeah, sorry.
No, don't say sorry, that was great.
Okay, well, I'll keep you in my prayers too.
Other questions? Yes.
What have you found to be helpful to maintain this perspective in extended seasons of discatastrophe?
This perspective in terms of,
Eucatastrophe.
Eucatastrophe.
And maintaining that hopeful
Yeah.
disposition.
well, I think this is an answer that may initially seem unrelated, but being part of a community where there are things at regular lengths, at regular intervals like this, I find that there are events that are offered, say, by my local community. They do like a St. Patrick's Day pub night, and there are those Shakespeare readings, like I said, and making myself go to those sometimes. It's like drinking water before you think you're going to need it. That has tended to be the case for me. There is an arts guild where I am of Christian artists, and I ended up serving on the staff of this guild, and it was like pulling teeth from myself at the beginning in order to make myself go, because it was every month, and I would get in the car and be like, I don't want to go, but I have to go because I'm part of the team that's helping to support this. But there were, through a bunch of events that happened, well, it was God basically who told me to look for the spark of his image in each person. And when that happens, I think there's no way that you can deny what he is doing all around you, the work that is going on, and the glory that he is manifesting day after day. And so, yeah, I think that goes back to the regularity thing, as I was saying. Just having that perspective and watching him do that work kept me in touch with the reality of Eucatastrophe. That's what I would say.
Other questions?
Did you have like a specific eucatastrophic piece of art that helped you get through your healing time of anxiety?
Many. I think I said in the talk that there were happenstance things that happened, small beauties, people that helped me to tie the notion of seeing something present in creation and realizing that was my conversation from this morning with Dr. Beitler. We were talking about Clyde Kilby and how he helped me not personally, but he helped me make the connection between if I was seeing a beauty, that in itself was a manifestation of the God who knew that I would be observing it at that time. But there's one special one that comes to mind, and I should say, I didn't remember the details of this until I was preparing for this talk. So maybe I was just supposed to remember it in time for this talk. But probably during one of the deepest parts of my valley after the breakdown, I ran into a friend at Barnes & Noble. And as we were talking about anxiety, she was just asking me how I was doing. She kind of gave me the impression that like, oh, you're not over it yet? And I was like, oh, am I supposed to be over it by now? And then as I was driving home, I thought the Lord was telling me something like, rise, let us be going. And I was like, that sounds good. Like, that sounds like a good phrase. Yeah, you know where I'm going with this. And I was like, that sounds like it's from Scripture. And then when I got home, I realized that's what Jesus says in Gethsemane when, like, rise, let us be going. He's got to go meet his death. And I thought, oh, gosh, okay. Like, all right, well, I have no control whether this road leads down or up. And I guess I'm just going with you. I have to move ahead with you in some way. And I think at some point that week, we got a letter from our sponsored child in Ecuador. And he loves to write us about his studies and his soccer games, and that's mostly what this letter was. And then all of a sudden, 3/4 of the way through, he said, and I feel like God wants me to tell you that we should move forward and keep going with him. And then there was more soccer and studies. And that was it. And I'm still gobsmacked by that. But there were little things like that. Momentous or not, some things took months to sink in, but those were all eucatastrophes for me, at least, that helped me to know that I wasn't forgotten and that I hadn't, discredited myself somehow from the presence of God. It was just kindness after kindness, and I think that's what I'm up here to say, is that if he will do that for somebody little and plain and ordinary, he will do that anywhere for those who feel little and plain and ordinary. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Does anybody have a final question for Amy? You want to pass the mic down?
Thank you for your talk. I've had the privilege while at Wheaton to be a part of a cohort that's been studying public humanities and arts and really looking at the impact of making humanities and arts projects for the public. One of the things we've been discussing is how to kind of design these projects in a way that is really fruitful for the community. But I guess I'm curious, since you've sort of talked about basically something very similar to this, how you kind of have approached these things, particularly with the goal of both maybe serving the community or the people you're welcoming into your home, but also of not just doing it to sort of check boxes, but to kind of get something out of it for yourself as well.
Well, in terms of doing it at a community level, I'm going to direct you to a piece by Brian Brown in something called Cultivating Magazine. I think the web address is thecultivatingproject.com. No, it's not. It's cultivatingoakspress.com. And there's a piece that he writes about planting a flag in a city where he did not want to be. And what they started doing, he and his wife started inviting people over for gatherings where they were really leading by delight and not as a desire to educate people or to expose them to the arts. And as that continued to grow, it grew into what is the Anselm Society today. But I'll also say, as I was saying in the talk too, that those things have inspired things on a family level for us. So I guess the last thing I'll share is that it's the 19th. So at the end of August, my wonderful husband helped me do this, but we decided to host a 2-day Feast of Eucatastrophe in our home. And I warned them that they were going to be guinea pigs in a way for this talk that was coming up where I was going to be talking about the celebration of Eucatastrophe. And I had no idea what would happen, but what I asked the participants to do, just our friends, was to each bring a story of a sudden joyous turn in their lives. And I think the first group knew each other well, the second didn't know each other quite as well, so the dynamic was a little bit different. But it was an extremely nourishing evening, at least for me, both evenings. because it was simply that. It was simply a group of people coming together and not trying to give each other false encouragement or just to dwell on the bright side of things, but to share about times in their lives where they had encountered God being the God of Eucatastrophe. And I had a little bit of a selfish motive for that going into that too, because I was like, I need you guys to bring these things because they will help to bolster me as I go into a new year of life. But I think every gathering, to some extent, that I've been a part of that has been life-giving has had some element of that, had some element of letting the transcendent break through and of letting people experience God's truth and beauty and goodness. And it may not happen for everybody that attends, but I think, as I said, what art does best in that capacity is to create room and a shelter for people to be able to encounter God that way, whether or not that's something that they can be completely receptive to at the moment. So I hope that helps.
Sounds like we have an assignment. Throw a feast of Eucatastrophe sometime in your life. Can you join me in thanking Amy one more time? So I want to give you some instructions about the book signing, but before I do that, one of the people that Amy quotes in the book is Diana Glyer. Diana Glyer is a fantastic writer, and she's coming to the Wade Center in Wheaton. She wrote a book called The Major and the Missionary, which is about a friendship between Warren Lewis and a missionary named Blanche Biggs. And on October 3rd, Kaylee Bell and Mark Lewis are going to perform that for us. So that's going to be fun. And then the next day, Diana Glyer, who wrote books like Bandersnatch, is going to talk about the unlikely friendship of Lewis and Tolkien. It's kind of a friendship semester, really, because after that, in late October, John Hendricks just is publishing a new graphic novel on the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien. It's called The Mythmakers. It's really fun. My son Arnie was reading it in bed the other night. And then finally, we're going to have a little celebration of our own. At the end of the semester, Tim Larson is going to be right here, and we're going to have a feast celebrating Christmas. And Tim knows a lot about Christmas. So it's going to be a very fun semester at the Wade. I hope you'll join us for all of these events. Now, what we're going to do is Amy will be ushered out there, and you can go buy her book and sign it. Thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful evening.